Welcome and thank you for joining us for another Gateway Area Plan video. Today we are going to evaluate the GIS analysis and graphic support that the city has used to develop this plan. My name is David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development with the City of Arcata, and I'm pleased to be bringing this content to you and hope that it furthers the discussion that we're having around form-based code. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have comments on this content. And as always, the City Council and Planning Commission are happy to hear from you as well. Before getting into the content for today, I want to make reference to some related content that we developed about a year ago, where we used the GIS work, the 3D modeling that was being developed at that time to help convey how a form-based code could be used to translate the standards from the GIS work that we had done. You can find that video either by the link below or using the QR code on the side here. And I encourage people to go and watch that because we go into a lot more detail about solar shading, the designs, and how they would translate through the form-based code. So that's a good resource for you if you're interested in this topic. Today, I really want to focus on the GIS work that we have had done to date and how we were using that, how it's been helpful in our analysis, and what other graphic support that we have available to us. This image is an image showing the current zoning. You'll see this orientation with Samoa and K Street identified throughout these graphics, or other street names identified to help orient you to the views, since these are a little odd for some folks to be looking at these maps and a little disorienting. That helps you orient. In this field of view, you see the existing zoning. There's a lot of industrial zoning in purple. The yellow zones and brownish zones are residential zoning districts, low, residential medium, and residential high. And then down in the eastern corner there, you see some commercial zoning along Samoa Boulevard. Now, the reason why the GIS started with the existing zoning is because the GIS was primarily an analytics tool to help us understand how changes in zoning that are being proposed through the Gateway Area Plan would affect the environment, how they would affect utilities, how they would affect circulation, and these kinds of environmental review questions. So we had to start with a baseline, and that baseline is current zoning. We compared that with the proposed zoning, which you see here, the various gateway districts. In the south there's the Gateway Barrel District. The blue color just north of that is the Gateway Hub. Green is the Gateway Corridor, and the pink is the Gateway Neighborhood. Each of these different zoning districts has differences from existing zoning, and each of them has differences from the others in the proposed districts relative to building heights and various other standards. And so we wanted to be able to compare these using our GIS data. Wanted to take a moment and zoom in. You've noticed the white boxes. Those white boxes, as we zoom in, you can see are existing structures. The GIS data was able to bring in data that are existing to draw these three-dimensional figures. And so you can see that we have them scattered throughout various neighborhoods, both within and outside of the gateway area. Looking in an isometric view, you can see those really are three-dimensional structures. You can see they cast shadows. The GIS is pretty useful in being able to evaluate several different features on the ground. Now, I've turned on what we refer to as the jewel box or the glass box model. What these reflect or represent are the existing zoning. So again, you're seeing those purples, yellows, and orange colors. Existing zoning, setbacks, and maximum building heights. And so you can see these glass boxes define those parameters based on current zoning, and then you can see the white boxes inside of those, the existing build out. One thing you'll notice is that within the existing build out, there are no buildings that occupy the entire space within these glass boxes. And that is because there are other development standards or operational standards for the site that limit the full build out potential based on just setbacks and maximum building height. The reason why I bring this to your attention is because those glass boxes have limited utility in describing how the built environment will look in the future. Now, we did the same thing with the proposed zoning. We have proposed zoning with these different gateway districts, and we were able to develop glass box model for the maximum extent zoning based on setbacks and maximum height. Obviously, with the gateway, the proposal was to allow for much taller buildings in the gateway hub, the sort of orangey pink color there near Samoa. This shows you an 8-story maximum building height. The blue, I'm sorry, that's the Barrel District. The blue hub just north of that, you'll see a 7-story, and the green corridor 6, and the pink neighborhoods are 5. Now, these were the designs based on the original draft proposal. The Planning Commission has since made a recommendation to reduce those building elevations by 1 floor, but this gives you a sense of the maximum jewel box build out potential based purely on the setbacks and the maximum building height. Many of you who've been following this are aware that there are other development limitations, such as step backs on upper floors that are called for currently in the plan. And you can see the glass box does not provide you with that sort of detail. So this has a lot of utility in helping us to understand the site's impact on the environment in terms of the way that the GIS models those impacts on the environment, but it doesn't give us a whole lot of information about the built environment. You can see that the built environment existing is much less, it's more reduced than the existing zoning glass boxes. And similarly, anything that was built out using the proposed zoning would come in at drastically reduced volumes than you see in those glass boxes. Okay, so we wanted to take a slightly deeper look at design than these glass boxes could provide. At one point, we were hoping that we'd be able to get really well-defined GIS models that we'd be able to put into this model and do a lot with them. What we wound up with was a couple of sites that we tested this on. And so we have these several sites here. And the reason we picked these sites was because they're relatively vacant or underutilized or have some infrastructure that could be demolished and then rebuilt. And because these are sites that have varying degrees of development potential on them that we wanted to test later in the process. And so we use these sites to develop some GIS models. What you see inside of the glass boxes here on those 4 sites are the models that were developed through this GIS exercise. Zooming in on the car wash parcel, for example, you'll note that the maximum development potential is much less than the glass box again. And with this particular design, we were able to take the form-based code, the gateway area code, design parameters, the setbacks, the articulation in the building, and the step backs on the upper floors, and build a model. Now, this was not developed by an architect. This was developed using the GIS software. And it was developed using the modeling capabilities of the GIS. So these were not hand-drawn. This same site and this same model was described in that August of 22 video that we released. And we use this to show how the setbacks and step backs, the building elevations, and other standards could be conveyed through this level of modeling. But it's clear that this does not give you a real true sense of what a building might actually look like. But this is the level that the GIS software is capable of doing. This one is very refined. We also have several models that were built to help us do the environmental analysis that are a lot cruder. This more gross scale analysis using just step backs and setbacks, for example, can provide the GIS software with an estimate of the uses and the inputs and outputs that would come from those uses and the volumes of those uses without giving that extra refinement that you saw in the last image with some of the step backs. So we have a gross scale model that we've been developing, and we have a further refined scale model that we developed with the GIS platform, but neither one of those really gives you a true sense of what the development will look like in the future. But it does give us a very good resolution on some of these environmental impact analytics that we're developing. Zooming back out and looking at the full model again, I wanted to point out that these sites also were chosen because they provided the approximate 500 units in these model scenarios that we anticipate over the next 20 years. And so that's how this model was used to develop that environmental impact report information that we need. We also had another model of 500 units that had slightly more dispersal, getting some development into the Gateway neighborhood as well. But let's stick with this model for now because we actually use these with our architects to do some test sites. So we can draw these, but we don't know how feasible they are. We don't know how they would actually look. We don't really know how they would perform based on these GIS models, but we do know that they would physically fit on the site. We worked with Urban Field Studios to look at these sites and run some test scenarios. Now, they didn't develop 3D models. They didn't draw these buildings out in 3 dimensions. They looked at them in 2 dimensions and tried to develop feasible working models to test the Gateway code and to make sure that it was feasible. And then they had some recommendations for us. So take a look at the car wash parcel to start. This is what they came up with. Now you'll note some significant differences here. In the Urban Field Studios design, Jolly Giant Creek is not daylighted on the northwestern portion of the site. They felt like it would be cost prohibitive along with some other recommendations, but what they found for us was a site that supported 87 dwelling units with a density of 61 dwelling units per acre. They show some retail and some studios and mix of different bedroom types here. Now, the next thing that they did was they came and assessed their design and said, well, how feasible is this? How can we make it better? What would you have to do to the code to change this? And so I'm going to provide you a summary of the architect's observations for each of these test sites. They said, hey, look, these sites are great. They're within quarter mile of Arcata Plaza, an existing commercial hub. They had some concerns that adding new retail to this site at the current population of Arcata would not necessarily be feasible, so not requiring retail, which our code currently doesn't, is their recommendation. They offered that the large setbacks that were in the draft code at the time, as well as the step backs, and the idea to daylight the creek would impact the efficiency of the build and would make it so that it was cost prohibitive. And so those were some of the recommendations they made on this site. Based in part on some of the recommendations that came out of this work, the Planning Commission ultimately did make their recommendation to reduce those setbacks to allow for larger building potential. Let's look at the AmeriGas site. On this site, they developed a similar mixed-use building and came to the same conclusions that the mixed use is really a challenge for this site. Structured parking they felt like was going to be expensive. Now, because of the limitations on parking that we have for the Gateway area as currently proposed, they wouldn't necessarily need to provide a structured parking. They would be able to do surface parking and or no parking for the most part. They also noted that this site being large has a lot of flexibility, and so this is one potential design. There are lots of ways that you could structure this. Looking at the site adjacent to or across the street from the Creamery building, This is a really dense site in the gross model that was produced through the GIS. You can see a much smaller project was developed by the architects. Again, they were trying to get some retail in there, and came to the conclusion that retail isn't probably going to work, at least in the near term with current population densities. And then also to take into consideration relocation. Now I want to pause here and point out that they've got a parking structure on the south part of this parcel. Right now, there's a community garden that is maintained and managed by Redwood Coast Montessori, which is nearby the site. This is not a regulatory proposal. This is not even a proposal for this site. The whole purpose of these images was to test the code and see, could you build a building on the site? Would it be feasible? And what recommendations do the architects have? So I don't want anybody to take from this that the proposal is to eliminate any current assets. In fact, we would love to see things like the community garden continue into the future. Okay, taking a look at the St. Benny's site, again, a lot smaller site, a lot less attractive in terms of the configuration of the site, but we wanted to test this site as well because it was included in that GIS modeling, and also because we wanted to test a range of different types of sites. This one's considerably smaller, and the architect said that the proposed larger setbacks that were proposed originally really had a huge impact on the potential for this site. Again, not recommending mixed use on this site, and also suggested that this might be a better site for townhouses. In sum, they made the recommendations that we should reduce the setbacks and be careful about zoning criteria that are going to impact the feasibility of these projects. They suggested that we do additional testing on the sites once we've resolved on what we'd like to see in our code, working with an economist to run pro forma on specific building sites on those, and make sure that it's feasible, because ultimately we don't want to create a code that no one can actually build to. And then lastly, they made the recommendation to not require retail, and luckily that's already in our plan. We wouldn't require the retail. I want to encourage you to go and listen to the architect's full presentation, which is on the Planning Commission's July 11th, 2023 recording. It's a great place for you to go and hear directly from the architect about these test sites. But you can see that we've walked through from the design, looking at glass boxes and moving that into GIS designed buildings to help us understand the environmental impacts, to specifically testing those sites, getting feedback on the code, and how we leverage those into a final decision is an important next question for us. So I want to pause for a second, because that was the analysis that was done more recently, moving us from those glass boxes models and then up to an architect's interpretation. In August of last year, in that video that I'd mentioned earlier in this video, we took a look at this site. And again, we took the design that was based on the GIS work, using those setbacks, site-specific standards, massing standards, and we asked Julian Berg to show us a design. What could this look like? And so Julian came up with this design, which does incorporate daylighting the creek, does have a 5-story mixed 4-story development. And we don't have financial feasibility on this particular design, but this is a way that we can convey how the form-based code could be interpreted by an architect, and these are the types of developments that we might see coming out of this form-based code. This design is completely consistent with the current draft form-based code, and in fact, now with the smaller setbacks, this design could be a little bit closer to the street frontage. But you can see here, it creates a lot of private space for living space. There's some of these buildings could be mixed use, and there's also a large public space surrounding the daylighted creek. I want to pause there and transition into the graphics that are yet to come. So this is a graphic that we produced. that we'd like to incorporate into our planning process, we still have a contract with our designers and our architects to produce additional graphics for the form-based code, for the gateway code. Those graphics we want to be real targeted with, though. We want to make sure that we're not having the designers and the architects draw buildings that then aren't feasible or aren't practical or aren't possible even if we change our code. And so with the information that we've developed at this point, we'd like to resolve on a gateway code that then gives additional direction to our designers to provide additional graphics for that gateway code. Here are some examples of what those graphics might look like. Now you have everything from the schematic showing the block layout in the middle to the design just below that showing some front yard amenities and setbacks, all the way to something that has a little bit more to the common eye, way to convey what these future builds might look like. Now, none of these graphics that I'm showing you here are proposed for our gateway plan. These are not out of the plan. They're not based on the plan. These are examples from other codes of what we will expect to see in our final code. And this gives you a sense for either facade articulation, block layout, or streetscape. We're also going to have some graphics that convey massing, and it will likely be similar to these, where you have existing buildings, similar to the GIS work that I showed you before with the white buildings that are existing buildings. And then in these examples, the buildings that are colored are either future proposed buildings or potential buildings based on the design that were outlined in these particular codes. And so we'll have something similar in our code where you'll be able to see the massing for these future builds based on, again, it's going to be a gross design. You're not going to have, all of the architectural detail that you saw in Julian's drawings, but you will have a sense for how build out the community could be based on those parameters that we have in the code. I hope this has helped advance the conversation about what we anticipate seeing in our form-based code. And I hope you'll join us in the future for further discussions about moving this process forward, and tell us what you would like to see in the future of Arcata. Thanks so much for taking the time. And again, reach out to me or my staff, or City Council, or the Planning Commission.